At first glance, there doesn't seem to be much here. A pale moon, an empty field, a strange figure playing his pipes while goats move through the darkness. But look a little longer, and the scene begins to feel wrong. The figures have no faces. Their shadows stretch unnaturally across the ground. On one side, the moon opens the landscape into light. On the other, enormous black trees rise like a wall. And between them, this creature seems to dance. We can see him making music, but we can't hear it. And somehow, that silence makes the image even more unsettling. Stranger still, this painting is not hanging in a museum where thousands of people can see it every day. For most of its existence, it has remained largely out of public view, hidden in a private collection. Which raises a question: what exactly are we looking at? An innocent mythological scene? A strange dance under the moon? Or something much darker? Because the story becomes even stranger when you discover who painted it and how young he was when he did. The artist was Léon Spilliaert, a young Belgian who was still only 18 or 19 when he created this image around 1900. That alone makes the painting remarkable. It doesn't feel like the work of someone just beginning his career. There is already something deeply personal in it. Something lonely, strange, and psychologically intense. Spilliaert was not living the life of a carefree young artist. He suffered from poor health and persistent insomnia, spending long nights awake while the rest of the city slept. And during those hours, his imagination was being fed by two writers he admired intensely, Edgar Allan Poe and Friedrich Nietzsche. One gave him worlds of darkness, mystery, and psychological fear. The other challenged accepted ideas about morality, instinct, and the individual. Put all of that together: youth, sleeplessness, isolation, and an obsession with darker ideas. This painting begins to feel less accidental. But before we decide what it might reveal about Spilliaert himself, we first need to look carefully at what he actually put on the page. The painting is called Faun by Moonlight. Spilliaert made it with diluted India ink, black crayon, and coloured pencil on paper. Materials far more intimate than a monumental oil painting. And it is surprisingly small, only about 49 by 63 centimetres. But inside that modest sheet of paper, Spilliaert creates a landscape that feels almost endless. Most of the image is empty. The faun and the goats occupy only a small part of the landscape, surrounded by an enormous field and an even larger sky. That empty space makes them seem isolated, almost swallowed by the night. The faun himself is a mythological creature, half human and half goat, caught in the act of playing his pipes. But look at his body. He isn't standing calmly. One leg is lifted as though he is dancing to his own music, and one of the goats seems to rise up as well. Suddenly the scene feels less like a simple procession and more like a strange choreography unfolding beneath the moon. There is another curious detail. It's difficult to tell who is actually leading whom. Are the goats following the faun? Is he calling them toward him? Or are they all participating in the same mysterious dance? Spilliaert gives us just enough information to recognize the scene, but not enough to feel certain about what is happening. And that uncertainty is where the painting begins to become truly unsettling. Part of the answer lies in the colour. Spilliaert reduces almost everything to blacks, greys, and pale whites. There are no warm colours to soften the scene, no vivid details to make it feel alive. The moon is the only real source of light, but even that light feels cold. Instead of illuminating the world, it seems to drain the colour out of it. The figures are reduced to silhouettes. We cannot see the faun's expression. We cannot read the goats' faces. They stop feeling like individuals and begin to look more like symbols, or even apparitions. And then there are the trees. On the right side of the image, they rise like a dark barrier, while the left side opens toward the moon. The faun appears almost suspended between those two spaces, between openness and enclosure, light and darkness. Even the shadows feel strange. They stretch across the ground toward us, making the figures seem more present and, at the same time, less real. And perhaps the strangest detail is the silence. We can see the faun playing, we know there should be music, but the image gives us none. It is a scene built around music, yet it feels completely silent. That contradiction may be one of the reasons the image stays in your mind long after you look away. To understand why an image like this could emerge, we have to return to Europe around 1900. It was a world standing between two centuries. Modern science was advancing, cities were expanding, and everyday life was changing rapidly. But the faster the modern world became, the more many artists seemed fascinated by everything that could not be easily explained: dreams, instinct, the occult, and the hidden regions of the mind. This was the atmosphere of symbolism. While realism looked outward at the visible world, symbolist artists often turned inward. They were less interested in showing things exactly as they appeared than in suggesting what might exist beneath the surface. Around this same period, Freud was making dreams and the unconscious part of a new psychological conversation. Debussy had already transformed Mallarmé's dreaming faun into music, blurring the boundary between reality and fantasy. And writers like Poe, along with thinkers like Nietzsche, were pushing readers toward darker questions about fear, morality, instinct, and the self. Precisely the kind of ideas that fascinated the young Spilliaert. So the strange world of Faun by Moonlight was not completely isolated from its time. It belonged to an age obsessed with turning the invisible into images. And once we understand that, the creature beneath the moon becomes much more complicated. Because the faun itself had carried two very different meanings for centuries. For centuries, the faun has been an ambiguous creature. In Roman mythology, it belonged to the forests and fields, a spirit associated with fertility, music, and untamed nature. Its Greek counterpart, the satyr, was associated with Dionysus. These creatures could represent pleasure, vitality, and freedom from restraint, but also instinct, excess, and desires that civilization tries to control. So there is an innocent way to read Spilliaert's scene. Perhaps this is simply a creature of nature playing beneath the moon, while the goats respond to his music. A strange image? Yes, but still almost pastoral. But the painting makes that interpretation difficult to hold on to. The faun appears to dance. One goat rises toward him. The others gather as dark silhouettes. Their bodies and shadows seem to form a loose circle of movement beneath the moon. Suddenly, what looked playful can begin to resemble something ceremonial. And goats carry darker associations in later Christian imagery, with temptation, sin, witchcraft, and eventually even the demonic. Seen through that lens, the scene changes completely. The faun is no longer simply entertaining the animals. He begins to look like the figure at the center of some nocturnal rite. And perhaps the most disturbing question is this: are the goats following his music or answering a summons? But there is still another possibility, one that has far less to do with mythology or religion and much more to do with Spilliaert himself. Some critics have suggested that this solitary creature could function as a kind of alter ego for the young artist. And once you know something about Spilliaert's life, the idea becomes difficult to ignore. He suffered from a chronic ulcer and endured long periods of insomnia. While other people slept, Spilliaert remained awake for hours, drawing in the silence of the night. Those hours became part of his artistic world. Empty streets, darkness, isolation, and the strange mental state that comes from being awake when everyone else is unconscious. Now look again at the faun. He stands almost alone in an enormous landscape, surrounded not by people, but by creatures that resemble shadows. And what does he do in that emptiness? He creates music. If we follow this interpretation, that music begins to resemble Spilliaert's own art. Something created in solitude, perhaps as a way of giving form to thoughts, fears, and fantasies that had nowhere else to go. The faun may not be summoning demons at all. Perhaps he is trying to keep his own demons under control. Spilliaert never gave us a clear explanation of what Faun by Moonlight was supposed to mean. He never told us whether we were looking at mythology, ritual, or something drawn from his own inner life. So look at the painting one more time. A pale moon, an empty field, a faceless faun playing music we cannot hear, and a group of goats disappearing into the darkness. Maybe it is nothing more than a strange mythological dance. Maybe we are witnessing some darker nocturnal ritual. Or perhaps the faun is a young artist alone with the creatures of his own imagination, turning fear into art. But there is one question the painting still refuses to answer. Where is he taking them? Toward the moonlight, or back into the darkness? What do you see when you look at this painting? An innocent myth, a disturbing ritual, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.